Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We're going to spend some time this hour really just doing a teaching and really look at the subject of Islam, the concerns about terrorism and radical Islam, as well as the impact that this is having on persecuted Christians. And as we go through this, a lot of the material can be found in my new book, Understanding Islam and Terrorism, A Biblical Point of View. But I'm also going to be referring to a number of other books, and those are individuals that we've interviewed on this program as well. So as you go to our website, pointofview.net, you can actually look up and actually listen to some of the other interviews that were certainly significant in some of the teaching. And so when we talk about the subject of Islam, I think it's important to recognize that we need to put it in a context with other kinds of religions. And if you'd like to follow along, we have posted a PDF of this presentation that I'm giving this hour, so you can go to pointofview.net and follow along, or certainly just sit back and listen, maybe take some notes. And of course, if you want to get a copy of my book or some of the other resources we have at Point of View, of course, they're available as well. But when we talk about these world religions, you can think about the fact that you can really put most of the major religions in the world in one of two categories. Either we have those religions that actually trace back to Abraham, or you have those ones that are from the east that go to the Indus Valley and trace back to the Aryans. When we talk about Abraham, let's first of all talk about those who are Jewish. The Jewish faith has been around for obviously millennia. And yet, interestingly enough, there are only about 18 million Jews in the world. Interestingly enough, about 6 million in Israel, about 6 million in the United States, about 6 million in the diaspora. Those are round numbers, but just gives you a little bit of a sense that almost everything accomplished by Jewish people are accomplished by a very small number indeed when we compare it to the other numbers we're going to look at. First of all, Christianity. There are about 2 billion people on the planet that claim to be Christians. That doesn't mean they're all born again, not even saying that they are, but I am saying that in one way or another they trace something back, either in terms of a personal faith or in terms of historical understanding to Christianity. And then the one we're going to focus most of our time and attention on today is Islam, with about 1.5 to 1.6 billion adherents around the world. And it's important to recognize, just as I talked about with Christians, sometimes people are born into a Christian culture or born into a Christian family, but they really don't necessarily believe everything about it. Likewise, that is so true as we talk about Islam, as we will in just a few minutes, because there are individuals who actually maybe grew up in a Muslim family or a Muslim country. As a matter of fact, if you're born in a Muslim country, you're assumed to be a Muslim, and if you try to convert out, sometimes there are great penalties, including the possibility of death if you convert out of that. So those individuals may actually be very strong adherents of Islam, or maybe not necessarily, and so we'll talk about some of that in just a minute. Well, that, I think, summarizes Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Let's, if we can, for just a minute to be complete, talk about those Eastern religions, and you have about 900 million Hindus around the world, and about 360 million Buddhists around the world, and so those represent the Eastern religions. And so that, I think, is really important. But let's, if we can, now focus most of our time and attention on Islam. And as I said, about 1.5 billion Muslims around the world. But let me begin to clarify some of the misconceptions that I think some people actually have about this. And that is, yes, you have about 380 million Muslims in the Middle East, but you have many more in other places. It has been, I think, sometimes typical to assume that Islam is primarily a Middle Eastern religion. That is certainly where it began, but it has certainly spread far and wide. You have, for example, about 115 million Muslims in North Africa, because, as we'll see in just a minute, after Muhammad gave his revelation, the Muslim army moved out from Mecca and took over a great deal of northern Africa. And if you look at those countries like Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, you come up with about 550 million Muslims. As a matter of fact, the one country that has more Muslims than any other country, interestingly enough, is Indonesia, which is really a far eastern country, and illustrative again of the fact that Islam has spread much further than just from the Middle East. Let me now, just before we take our first break, talk about a little bit of the history of Islam. And it's pretty easy to describe indeed, because you can go back to the fact that Islam began an individual by the name of Muhammad, who was born into a very powerful Arab tribe in Mecca in 570 A.D. Now, his father died, then his mother died. He was raised for a while by his grandfather, who died, then eventually by his uncle. And he really supported himself in his early years by traveling in caravans. But by the age of 25, something very significant happened in his life, and that is he married a very wealthy widow who was 15 years his senior. She was 40, he was 25. And because of her wealth, no longer had to travel in those caravans. And so, in a sense, sort of settled down. But then when he became age 40, that would be AD 610, he began to have these experiences, which he later concluded were his calling, and actually said that he was called by the angel Gabriel to begin to proclaim a very different kind of religious idea. Matter of fact, Gabriel, the angel, supposedly said, recite, and that's where you actually get the word Quran, because that is this idea of a recitation. And so he began in the midst of this culture that he was growing up in which there were a number of gods in what is today known as the Kaaba, that he began to preach a very strict monotheism in a culture that was polytheistic. And so this caused him to, in many cases, be rejected for his preaching, and eventually in AD 622 actually left from Mecca to an oasis in the north, which today is known as Medina. And if you ask any Muslim, when did Islam begin? This is known as the Hijra, and lots of times what they will do is they'll have their date with an AH, meaning after the Hijra, take our calendar, subtract 622, and you will come up with the Muslim calendar. Well, we're going to take a break, but when we come back, I'm going to talk about what happened when he was in Mecca and in Medina, and how this very significant change moving from Mecca to Medina changed some of the writings that we have in the Quran, and as a result ultimately led to the most incredible expansion of a world religion in the history of the world. And so we're going to talk about how that gave us the world that we saw, the spread of Islam, its distribution. Then we'll spend some time talking about the theology of Islam, talk about how to witness to our Muslim friends, and then we'll get into the issue of terrorism. What do radical Muslims believe? What about Al-Qaeda? What about ISIS? And eventually we'll talk also about the impact that this is having on persecuted Christians. But we need to take a break. So again, if you'd like to follow along, we have a PDF of this presentation. It's available on the website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation about Islam right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
columnist named Virginia is facing a dilemma. She lives in Brooklyn Heights and doesn't know what to make of her neighbor who recently plowed her driveway without being asked. The neighbors are what she calls Trumpites, and she is a Harvard-educated liberal journalist. Rod Dreher writes about this because normal people don't have a problem with such an act of kindness, no matter who provides it. She, on the other hand, says it's kind of weird. Back in the city, people don't sweep other people's walkways for nothing. Then she wondered if the neighbors heard Senator Ben Sasse suggest that we clean another neighbor's walk. That's it. They were probably trying to make a bid for reconciliation, she concluded, and she added they probably aren't even looking for absolution anyway. Rod Dreher observes, let me tell you something, Virginia. Your neighbors probably have no idea who Ben Sasse is and isn't looking to reconcile with you, much less receive your absolution. They wanted to do something nice for you because you are their neighbor, and that's what neighbors do for each other. The fact that you assume there must be some politically aware motive behind the action says a lot about you. He tries to explain to her that most people in America will do nice things for friends and neighbors without stopping to ask about their politics. In a small town, the guy you'll need to call to saw up the tree that fell across your driveway might have MAGA and NRA stickers on his truck. He might also do it for free because he knows you've been sick and have medical bills. You know, it's a sad commentary that Virginia, and so many other liberals like her, failed the snowplow test. They can't set aside their politics and their suspicion. Plowing snow, raking leaves, mowing lawns for others, that's what neighbors do. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again talking about Islam, and we've been looking at the history of Islam, and I won't spend a lot of time here. One of the chapters in my book goes into it in a lot more detail, but again, we recognize that Muhammad was born into a very powerful Arab tribe, began to preach a strict monotheism in a polytheistic culture, and eventually, because he was rejected for his preaching, left from Mecca into an oasis, which later has been called Medina. And while he was there, that changes a lot. And it's important to understand, as we talk about in just a few minutes, the issue of radical Islam, because when he was in Mecca, he was a prophet. But when he's in Medina, he really is kind of a commander of what ultimately became the Muslim army. And so sometimes he actually raided caravans. There were some battles that took place, perhaps one of the most significant is the Battle of Badr, which he won, others which he didn't do so well. But eventually he becomes the dominant force in the Arab Peninsula, and he takes 10,000 men back to Mecca and takes it almost without a fight because of working out some of the situation with the fathers of the city, and now institutes this strict monotheism, removes all the things from the Kaaba, and instead has now a worship of Allah. That takes place, and then something 2 years later really happens almost unexpectedly, and he dies. But rather than that being the end of Islam, it is one of the most remarkable expansions of a world religion in history. Because first, you have the Arab army moving out to the east from Arabia to Persia, and this becomes, in a sense, the taking of everything from today, which would be modern-day Syria and Iraq and many of the stand countries. And then the Muslim army also begins to move through, as I applied just a minute ago, through northern Africa, takes all of northern Africa, takes Spain, which becomes kind of Moorish Spain. And if it were not for the defeat of the Muslim army at the hands of Charles Martel in what today would be France, could have taken most of Europe. And so when you look today at the distribution of Islam, and we have this on the PDF, which is available on our website, you can see that as you look across the countries of the world, you will see those countries which have any kind of Muslim influence are found in northern Africa, the Middle East, as well as a number of other places. And what I've done on this particular diagram is superimpose some red lines over what is called the 1040 window. And that is a particular area of the world that missionaries and mission organizations have identified as places where the gospel needs to be brought. And you can see as you look at that how many of those particular areas are actually held by Muslims. And so one of the great, I think, evangelistic challenges in the 21st century is the desire to reach the Muslim world for Christ. And so, again, you can see that in the diagram. You also see that there's a difference between the light green, which would be the Sunni Muslims, and the dark green, which would be Shia. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. And really to get into this whole issue of, well, what do Muslims believe? That is the second chapter in my book, Understanding Islam and Terrorism. And when we talk about the theology, there's a pretty simple way to summarize what most Muslims believe. Obviously, there are differences, but most Muslims hold to what are called the 5 pillars of Islam. The first pillar is the repetition of the creed, the Shahada. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That is something they say on a regular basis. It is something that is whispered into the ear of a newborn. It's something oftentimes said at the death of a Muslim as well. And so the first is the creed. Second are the prayers. Muslims pray 5 times a day, the Salat, and they pray as they face towards Mecca. Then you have the zakat, which is almsgiving. They are to give 1/20 or 5% of their income towards the advancement of Islam. Then you have the fast of Ramadan. This takes place during the 9th lunar month to celebrate the revelation that was given to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel. And then finally you have what is known as the Hajj, or the pilgrimage. Every able-bodied Muslim is to at least once in his or her lifetime make a pilgrimage to Mecca. And the celebrations that take place over the Kaaba, in the Kaaba is a black stone that came from the sky. Many people believe it was probably a meteorite. And some of the traditions there in the pilgrimage are those which actually predate Islam and were those which were practiced even by Muhammad's father. So those are known oftentimes as the 5 pillars of Islam. Some people say, actually, they're not 5 pillars of Islam, but actually there's a 6th pillar of Islam, and that pillar would be jihad. Jihad, really, if you have a copy of the Quran in English, usually is translated as struggle or to strive. And for some Muslims, that means just the striving to conform my will to the will of Allah. But in the more traditional sense, and in the particular PDF I've made available, I quote from Professor Bernard Lewis, the emeritus professor from Near Eastern Studies at Princeton, who I think summarized it probably the best by saying, the more common interpretation, and that of the overwhelming majority of the classical jurists and commentators, presents jihad as armed struggle for Islam against infidels and apostates. And so you can begin to see that opens up the possibility then for those who are radical Muslims to interpret the scriptures in that way. Which immediately brings me back to, well, what are the scriptures? What are the holy books of Islam? And the first one, of course, is the Quran. The Quran is made up of a number of chapters known as surahs, and these particular chapters actually describe what a Muslim should do. You have most of these surahs or chapters which were written when Muhammad was in Mecca. Those are known as the Meccan surahs. And then you have a number set that were actually written when he was in Medina, and those are called the Medina surahs. But again, these are supposedly the recording of the revelation that Muhammad received from the angel Gabriel. But if you read through that, I think your natural conclusion would be, I'm not sure I understand all of this, because some of it sounds like Old Testament quotes and a variety of other things, but almost everything that I've come to associate with being a Muslim, I do not find in the Quran. And that's because it's not in the Quran, it's in the Hadith. The Hadith are really the traditional sayings of Muhammad, and I've oftentimes said the best way to understand that is to think of those little bracelets maybe you've seen before. WWJD, what does that stand for? What would Jesus do? Well, there's a sense in which Muslims have WWMD, what would Muhammad do, but they mean it in a much more literal sense. Whereas we say, what would Jesus do in terms of our ethical behavior? What would Muhammad do means whatever Muhammad did in that century becomes almost normative today. And so that explains a great deal about the dress, about the views about the rights of women, human rights, even how an individual prays, what they pray, how they go about it. All of those is found very much in the Hadith. And so, again, we can begin to, as we get into this, talk a little bit more about the differences between, say, a Muslim view and a Christian view. And ultimately, I want to talk, as we come back from the break, about how we can actually witness to Muslims. But one of the things that you see most striking is that Christians and Muslims have a very different view of God. You probably heard people say, well, Christians and Muslims worship the same God. Well, not exactly, because Christians believe in Trinitarian monotheism, whereas, of course, as I've just pointed out here, what you have is Unitarian monotheism in Islam. In Christianity, we have kind of this father-daughter, father-son kind of relationship. We can call God our Father. Whereas in Islam, there's more of almost like a master-slave relationship. Allah is somebody who determines all. Lots of times you'll hear the phrase, Sha'Allah. That means as Allah wills. Whereas Christians believe that God is good, God is sovereign, but we have free will. And so we can begin to see almost immediately the very different views of God, I think, open up some great opportunities for how we can witness to our Muslim friends. So when we come back from the break, I want to pull some of this material out from my book, talking about some of the studies that have been done and some of the experiences that various missionaries that are mostly undercover in Muslim worlds have found most effective in witnessing to Muslims, and some of the things that have been most effective in witnessing to Muslims here in the country. So first we'll talk about how to witness to our Muslim friends. Then we'll spend some time talking about, well, what about those who are radical? Where do those ideas come from, and how did they develop that, and what kind of threat do they pose to us in the future? A lot more to cover. We're talking about Islam. When we come back, we'll talk about witnessing to Muslims. Then we'll talk about radical Islam. Eventually, we'll get into the plight of persecuted Christians. All that coming up right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today as we talk about Islam. And just a few minutes ago, I talked about the fact that really the view of God is very different between Christians and Muslims in terms of the character of God. And that I think, provides one of many opportunities for witnessing. In my book, I talk about a seminary study that was done a number of years ago that actually originally surveyed about 600 former Muslims who had become Christians. Now I think it's up to about 700. But at that time, they asked about 600 former Muslims who had become Christians, what was the most significant factor in your conversion? And the number one reason was the love of God. Now, think about this for just a minute. For a Muslim, there is never really this idea of having a personal relationship with God. If you're a Christian listening right now, you know that we talk about having a personal relationship with God, that we can call God our Father, that God is knowable, that God came to earth in the person of Jesus Christ. For a Muslim, they say we can't know God. He is distant. He is unknowable. He is transcendent. Frankly, he's capricious. He's unpredictable. And so they have this desire to have a relationship with God, but they really don't know that they will have a relationship with God. And so as a result, one of the things that I would recommend that as you are talking with your Muslim friends is to talk about this idea of the love of God, of having a personal relationship with God. Now, the second factor that they mention is also relevant, and that is the issue of eternal security. We found, interestingly enough, that, again, a Muslim does not know if he or she will actually go to heaven, will not be sure of eternal life. And so, again, you can see how important it is to say in the Scriptures that you can know for certain that you will have eternal life. The key verse on all of this, of course, would be Ephesians 2:8-9, that we are saved by grace, not by works. Interestingly enough, Islam is probably one of the most works-oriented religions in the world. It is the assumption that I do enough good works, I follow the 5 pillars of Islam, and perhaps Allah, in that day of judgment, will allow me into heaven. But I have no certainty of that, and I have no relationship with him. And so, again, just something to think about. And one of the things that is so striking, which we've talked about with Joel Rosenberg on this program, with Tom Doyle and others, are more Muslims are becoming Christians just in the last few decades than all of the Muslims have become Christians in the last almost century and a half. So it has been striking to see, millennia and a half, I should say. It's been striking to see how many individuals who grew up in a Muslim background, due to dreams and visions, due to various kinds of interactions on the internet, due to meeting other Christians, have become Christians. One of the things that also has been kind of intriguing is a number of missionaries have said that you can even use their Quran to show them about Jesus. For example, if you go into the Quran, you see that it talks about Jesus. Now, they believe Jesus was just a prophet. But nevertheless, it's kind of interesting because it says that Jesus was born of a virgin. It says that Jesus is the Messiah. It says that Jesus has the power over death and that Jesus knows the way to heaven. You see that in Surah 3. It also, interesting enough, says in Surah 19 that Jesus was sinless. Now, there's a place in the Quran where Allah tells Muhammad to actually ask for forgiveness for his sins. So the obvious implication is Muhammad was sinful, but Jesus is sinless. And in Surah 46, it says that Muhammad did not even know what would happen to his followers. So one of the ways that some missionaries and others have used the Quran is to say, you know, you can read about this idea of Jesus being born of a virgin as a Messiah, has power over death, knows the way to heaven, who is sinless. Would you not like to know more about this sinless prophet, Jesus? Now, sometimes there's a hesitation. Well, yes, I would, but I'm not sure I am allowed to read the Bible. And again, that's where the Quran helps out, because in Surah 10, actually, interesting enough, Muhammad says, ask those who read the scriptures that came before you. Well, what were the scriptures that came before you? Well, those were the scriptures of the Old and New Testament. Matter of fact, in Surah 4, they're referred to as the before books, the books written before the Quran. And they are even told in Surah 5 to observe the Torah and the Gospels. So what you find is a permission which is given to Muslims, interestingly enough, to actually read the Bible. And so you can give them the Gospel of John or Matthew or Luke or whatever you might want to. And it's amazing how many Muslims have become Christians as a result of that. Now, again, it's also helpful, since I alluded to this earlier, to notice that Muslims are a little bit different. Just as we have denominations in Christianity, there are divisions in Islam, and two of the most primary ones are Sunni and Shiite. And on my PDF, I won't go into all the details, but Sunni represent about 80% of all of the population of the Muslim world. They tend to be the ones most likely to have come here. Many times they come here as exchange students, or they came here as technicians. Then Shiites, about 15%. Shiites are found mostly in the southern part of Iraq and Iran. And they really sometimes blur even more so the distinctions between church and state, or in this case, it would be mosque and state. And so as a result, there is, you see in Iran, where the religious authorities also have political authority as well. And the split all the way goes back to individuals at one time that said who are going to be carrying the following of Islam. And after Muhammad died, you had a number of leaders known as caliphs. And eventually there was a split because there was a smaller group that thought that Ali, married to Muhammad's daughter, should be the next leader. And so this is where you had the initial split between Sunni and Shiite. And in my book, I go into a little bit more detail about how eventually they followed Ali's son, Hussein. You might remember Saddam Hussein or Barack Hussein Obama. The name Hussein, very important. And even to this day, because of Hussein being killed, many times you will see, and I have in my PDF here, a picture of Shiite Muslims carrying the Imam Hussein during their protest. And also in Iran, they also believe now that there was one imam, so-called 12th imam, that just went into hiding, didn't really die. And so this imam, known as Mahdi, will return again. And so some of the leaders, even in Iran, are actually those who follow the 12 Shiite ideas, or the Twelvers. And so that has been very important oftentimes as we talk about whether or not Iran should get nuclear weapons and what kind of danger they might actually provide. But before we finish off today, let me spend a little bit of time talking about some of the radical groups. And one of the most known is the group known as ISIS. And I get on my PDF here some information that comes from a very good book by Jay Sekulow, who's been on the program with us before. His book, Rise of ISIS, just reminds us that at one time it was one of the richest terrorist groups in the world, had more firepower, and still is a very dangerous entity in some parts of the world. They also used to go into various places and put the word the Arabic letter for N for Nazarene, and that was a way to actually mark that these are houses held by the Nazarenes or the Christians. And so just as they would oftentimes mark the houses and shops of Jews in Nazi Germany, so ISIS would mark the houses of those who were Christians. And when we come back in just a minute to talk about the idea of persecuted Christians, we can see how that has surfaced even to this day. But again, this has been an organization that has been radicalized, certainly has moved up and down the peninsulas of Syria and Iraq in particular, has been more brutal perhaps than even Al-Qaeda, and was one that really began out of some of the teachings of the Mujahideen back in the 1970s. And the Mujahideen at that time were led by a man by the name of Osama bin Laden. And then, of course, once later on that he was killed and some of his followers were killed, ISIS sort of moved into this, if you will, spiritual vacuum. And because of that, you have the kind of conflicts that we've had today and the ongoing battle between the West and these various groups, whether it's Al-Qaeda or whether it's ISIS. And so we'll take a break and come back and talk a little bit more about some of the theology of these radical Muslim groups, and also talk a little bit about how some of this theology has resulted in perhaps the greatest persecution of Christians today. And so we'll talk about some of the plight of persecuted Christians and what we as Christians can do. If you'd like to know a little bit more, of course, we have the PDF of this presentation on the website, and we certainly encourage you, if you'd like to know more, to even get a copy of my book, Understanding Islam and Terrorism, A Biblical Point of View. It's available at our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the radical theology of radical Muslims, why they pose a threat even to this day, and we'll cover that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Today we've been talking about Islam, and I wanted for just a few minutes to focus on some of the radical theological ideas in Islam. And as you've heard me already say, there are a lot of Muslims that you probably meet every day, and you can witness to them, and they do not pose any kind of threat. But what about those who are the radicals? And I think you have to begin by understanding that Islam oftentimes divides the world into two spheres: the House of Islam, called Dar al-Islam, and the House of War, Dar al-Harb. And so the House of Islam, of course, the nations under the control of Muslims, especially where Sharia law is enforced. And the House of War includes nations that are not under Muslim control and do not submit to Sharia law. And so under this idea from a jihadist point of view, and I'll use ISIS as an example, but this applies to others like Al-Qaeda or Hamas or Hezbollah, there is this idea that there will be a conflict, and a constant conflict between the House of Islam and the House of War until the House of War is transformed into the House of Islam. And at that point, then, they will be able to implement a global Islamic state known as a caliphate, and that this will be enforced by a supreme leader known as a caliph. And so you can see that what we are talking about here is something very different. And the leader for many years under Islam and under ISIS was a man by the name of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And he actually proclaimed that he was the Caliph Ibrahim back on the 4th of July, 2014, and did that in the mosque in Mosul. And if you look at one of his proclamations, you can kind of see these ideas all coming together. He said, "Fear Allah as he should be feared, and do not die except as Muslims. Go forth, O Mujahideen." Mujahideen were, of course, those Muslim fighters. You might remember the Mujahideen that fought against Russia in Afghanistan and fight against Western troops. Go forth, O Mujahideen, in the path of Allah. Terrify the enemies of Allah and seek death. For the dunya will come to an end and the hereafter will last forever. The dunya is kind of this idea of the world that we see right now, but it's kind of just a, if you will, sort of an illusion. It's the world that precedes before we bring about this apocalypse, where once the Muslim world takes complete domination, we have a worldwide caliphate in which we influence and begin to implement Sharia law under a caliphate. And so you can begin to see that in some respects what we're talking about here is a real desire to destroy everything in the West and the idea of democracy and all the rest. Matter of fact, one of the ISIS spokesmen, Sheikh Abdul Muhammad al-Adnandi, called on Muslims living in Western countries to find an infidel and smash his head with a rock, poison him, or destroy his crops. And I use that illustration, first of all, to show how violent it is. But second of all, notice that it says smash his head with a rock. You'd think they'd just say, well, shoot him. But it all the way goes back to the fact that in many cases, Islam, and especially for radical Muslims, is a 17th century religion. And that is a 7th century religion, I should say. And that is one which simply is kind of rooted in those lines that you find in the Quran where it says smash his head with a rock. We would tend to modernize that and say shoot him. But there is still this idea of using this concept. And this is why also swords are used and beheading is used, because it's found in those writings. Because in many ways, Islam is still a 7th century religion. We would say that Christianity is not really a 1st century religion. It began in the 1st century, but it's taken the concepts and applied those to, the modern world. And so in some respects, part of the challenge of Islam is it's still really sort of locked into the 7th century in a lot of ways. Nevertheless, of course, ISIS has been one that has wanted to destroy any kind of idols. So we've seen what has happened when they've taken over museums. But even ISIS has wanted to go and destroy the Kaaba in the Grand Mosque in Mecca. So you can see that in some respects, what you have even there is something that poses a threat even to other Muslims. Now, is Islam and is, in particular, ISIS and radical Islam in America? And the answer to that is yes. We've had Johnny Moore on the program, and actually the subtitle of his book was Define ISIS. ISIS is in your own backyard. And we, of course, have had examples of that. And one of the best pieces of evidence that came out is a number of years ago, the former FBI Director James Comey told the National Association of Attorneys Generals that we have investigations of people in various stages of radicalization in all 50 states. And so it's important to recognize that we live in a world today where ISIS is not just overseas, but we have ISIS and other radical groups even here. And this is one of the reasons why I would certainly encourage you to pray for those individuals that are in Homeland Security. Of course, pray for those in the Defense Department protecting us. And again, on my PDF, I show an ISIS handbook and others to try to gather various recruits. But finally, I wanted to spend just a minute talking about the importance of really praying for persecuted Christians. It is very difficult to live as a Christian in the Muslim world, and I've got some books here posted by Johnny Moore and Tom Doyle and others who just remind us of what it is like to actually live in these Muslim worlds And so, again, some great material. And as a matter of fact, the last time we had Johnny Moore on, he talked about the fact that when he went to the first refugee camp, he saw that many of them had crosses, and many of them actually had the name Jesus, even though they were just miles from where ISIS or other radical Muslims might be. They were still willing to hold up the cross of Jesus Christ. And so I think it is really important to recognize that as Christians, and as we wind down this hour, we first of all should pray for our fellow believers around the world. On the particular screen there, I have 2 Thessalonians 3:2. It tells us to pray that we may be delivered from wicked and evil men. And so certainly we should pray for those. And we've talked about the plight of persecuted Christians. We've had our friends from Open Doors and Samaritan's Purse and Voice of the Martyrs. And we also would encourage you to give to those organizations. A while back, we even encouraged many of you to give to the Cradle Fund, which provided funds for those in those refugee camps, because so many of them had to actually escape, sometimes just with the clothing on their back, and found themselves having to stand for Christ in a very difficult set of circumstances, some even having to avoid those refugee camps if there were Muslims there because of the fear that some might be ISIS operators that want to kill them. And so, again, there are all sorts of resources that we would certainly want to make available to you here at Point of View. So you can go to the website, pointofview.net. You can find the PDF file that I've been talking about and using for our presentation. You can find my new book, Understanding Islam and Terrorism, and it's a book that really is broken into a couple of sections. One of the sections, for example, looks at all the theology of Islam. The second section deals with Islam and terrorism and has a whole section on Sharia law. And then the third section just tries to answer some of the questions that people oftentimes have about Islam. So again, the book is available to you, and I hope that you'll take the time to learn a little bit more, because it will help you, first of all, know how to pray for persecuted believers. It would help you know how to witness to your Muslim friends, and it would also, I think, encourage you to pay attention to some of the great challenges we face from Islam in the 21st century, both in terms of missions and in terms of the threat of radical Islam. So I hope you've appreciated the presentation. You can find out more at our website, pointofview.net. I hope that you'll go there and find that material. And when you go there, don't forget that we are dependent upon your financial gifts to bring these programs to you. Need to take a break? We'll be back with more right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Let me ask you a question. How much time do you spend at work? Well, again, I love what David Platt uses in the foreword to the book we're going to be talking about. If you really look at people that work 40 hours a week for 40 years of their lives, that adds up to 80,000 hours at a job during their lifetimes. And, of course, those hours don't even include the thousands of hours spent in school preparing for work, on top of thousands of hours they spend in cars and planes and trains traveling to work. We're talking about something that really deserves us to think about from a Christian perspective. And so one of the things that we are going to try to do this hour is really focus on your work. And you've seen books on Your Work Matters to God. We've talked a great deal about how to apply a biblical view of work. And so we come to this book that came out a number of years ago, now is updated and expanded, The Gospel at Work, How the Gospel Gives New Purpose and Meaning to Our Jobs. Sebastian Traeger and Greg Gilbert are the authors, and Sebastian joins us. He's the Executive Vice President of the International Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention, but before that has worked in the business world and built a number of companies such as 5 Street and Razoo and Silos Partners and Village Phone, to mention just a few. And Sebastian, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is great to have you here, and the book is something we're going to try to cover over the next hour. Almost 200 pages of great insights. But to really understand this, you talk about how in some respects we can go to one extreme or the other. Either we can deal with idleness in work or idolatry in work. Let's talk about that, because you share, even in your own experience, that you felt that you at one time were guilty of maybe making your work an idol in some way or another. Explain that, if you might.
Yeah, so what we do in the book is we try to help people diagnose where they are in relation to a biblical view of work. And so one of the ways, and again, as you mentioned, I definitely would say I've been guilty of this. One of the ways we see people going wrong in the way they approach their work is that they make their work an idol. And so if you think about what an idol was in the Bible, obviously in the Bible we think of it as kind of gold statues that you might bow down to, or a golden calf in the wilderness. But it's effectively what an idol is anything that you organize and order your life around. And so certainly I think our culture puts a lot of pressure on us to order and organize our lives around our jobs and the work that we do. And as I kind of said biographically in the book, I know that for myself, this is something I've been guilty of. I've been guilty of thinking that work is one of the most important things in my entire life. And so that has elevated, it's almost as though I've elevated my work above my relationship with Jesus.
Well, again, we recognize that in some respects our work is a primary source of significance for individuals. I know that you can go to some men retreats and other kinds of retreats where they'll say, we want you to introduce yourself to someone else, but not tell them what you do. And that can be a real stumper for some individuals, because everything they are is tied up in their profession. I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm a businessman, I work in this area, I'm a pastor, I'm a missionary, whatever it might be. And you can see how that right off the bat can cause people a little bit of distress if they can't really talk about themselves but are prevented from talking about their work because, after all, like we just mentioned a minute ago, 80,000 hours by the time you retire. It's obviously something that ties up very much with who you are and what you do every day.
Absolutely. Well, and even that thought, I mean, so I would say what we want to do is help people see that work is important. It's created by God. So if you think about theology of work, if you will, a lot of people sometimes think work is a product of the fall, of Adam and Eve's sin and rebellion against God. Well, that's actually not true. We see God was a worker, right? Obviously, in Genesis 1, God created the world. He created all things. He said it was good. And then he created Adam and Eve and said they are very good. And then he rested. And so we see work. He then gave Adam and Eve work to do in the garden, name the animals and take dominion effectively. And so we see work as a good gift of God. But what happened is that when Adam and Eve rebelled against God, no longer were we capable of perfectly worshiping God in the way that we work. Instead, we start worshiping things other than God. And so work becomes one of those things that we can worship. It was created to be something God created as good, something for us to worship while we did. But we, of course, start to effectively make it our identity, and it becomes something that we can worship. And that's just a danger we have to recognize and be aware of, the tendency to make an idol of that work.
Talking about the book, The Gospel at Work, it is published by Zondervan. You can certainly look for it in your local bookstore. We also have a connection and a link to the International Mission Board, so you can find out more as well. And just a minute ago, he was talking about kind of a biblical theology of work, and there's a number of appendices in the book. It's the second one there, a biblical theology of work from garden to glory. And so, again, in addition to the fact that there are some excellent chapters in the book, I might just mention for a minute, Sebastian, that as you finish a particular chapter, you also have a section for further reflection. So this is where you can read a particular passage. There's a series of questions. So while this book is certainly one that I would want to put in the hands of anybody that wants to think about how to apply a biblical worldview to their work, I would think the way you structured this now would be a great way for small groups to actually get into this issue as well, don't you think?
Well, that's our hope. When we wrote the book, you know, we think there's a number of other books out there, really primarily talking about, say, vocation or theology of work or the history of work, and we touch on that. But what we really want to do is be more pastoral in the way we treat the topic. We want to help people see, not just have another thing that feels pretty detached from their everyday, but actually have people wrestle around the very issues that impact them and affect them every single day in the workplace. For example, we want people to really wrestle with, okay, if the gospel saves me and the good news also means that one day I will spend eternity with Christ in heaven, how does that impact choosing a job, for example? How should I think about that differently as a Christian? Or how does that impact my relationship with difficult bosses or coworkers? How does that impact, for example, the way I'm motivated every day to do my job? So this is how we've kind of organized the book. And so we really hope it is a resource for small groups who want to say, yeah, we want to try to connect the Bible with that kind of 9 to 5. And that's really the heart of the book. And, you know, honestly, it came out of my own personal just desire for more answers. I think churches, do an amazing job at equipping us to understand the Bible, to pursue the Lord. But I think sometimes they might not do as great a job equipping us in thinking about the particulars of, say, a secular job and how I can glorify God with that and how I can do that in the most effective way.
Sebastian Traeger with us as we are talking about the book that he co-authored with Greg Gilbert, The Gospel at Work, How the Gospel Gives New Purpose and Meaning to Our Jobs, published by Zondervan. We talked a little bit about idolatry in work. We'll come back and talk about idleness in work. And then what about this idea of the gospel in the workplace? How does that fit? A lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A columnist named Virginia is facing a dilemma. She lives in Brooklyn Heights and doesn't know what to make of her neighbor who recently plowed her driveway without being asked. The neighbors are what she calls Trumpites, and she is a Harvard-educated liberal journalist. Rod Dreher writes about this because normal people don't have a problem with such an act of kindness, no matter who provides it. She, on the other hand, says it's kind of weird. Back in the city, people don't sweep other people's walkways for nothing. Then she wondered if the neighbors heard Senator Ben Sasse suggest that we clean another neighbor's walk. That's it. They were probably trying to make a bid for reconciliation, she concluded, and she added they probably aren't even looking for absolution anyway. Rod Dreher observes, let me tell you something, Virginia. Your neighbors probably have no idea who Ben Sasse is and isn't looking to reconcile with you, much less receive your absolution. They wanted to do something nice for you because you are their neighbor, and that's what neighbors do for each other. The fact that you assume there must be some politically aware motive behind the action says a lot about you. He tries to explain to her that most people in America will do nice things for friends and neighbors without stopping to ask about their politics. In a small town, the guy you'll need to call to saw up the tree that fell across your driveway might have MAGA and NRA stickers on his truck. He might also do it for free because he knows you've been sick and have medical bills. You know, it's a sad commentary that Virginia and so many other liberals like her failed the snowplow test. They can't set aside their politics and their suspicion. Plowing snow, raking leaves, mowing lawns for others, that's what neighbors do. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today as we talk about the gospel at work, how the gospel gives new purpose and meaning to our jobs. We spend so many hours every day, and how do we think about this biblically? And Sebastian Traeger with us. And Sebastian, we talked a little bit about idolatry of work. Before we get into some of the practical aspects, let's also talk about the other extreme, idleness in work. Now, most people might misunderstand. They might say, I'm certainly not idle. I'm working all the time. But that's not exactly the point you were making here, because in some respects, idleness has more to do with kind of a mindset, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And that's where, biblically, again, defined, you could say idleness means not working, doing nothing. And I think that's what Paul warns about when he says, he who doesn't work shall not eat. I think he's literally saying if you do nothing, you cannot eat. But when we think about idleness, obviously there's some who are not working, but I think more common to the Christian is the type of idleness of heart that detaches what it means to be a Christian,
yes,
the fact that the gospel has changed their lives with their work, with their day-to-day work. And so at some level, they have, if making an idol of work kind of elevates Jesus above their work, I think being idle at work almost lowers Jesus below your work, almost makes it less important than it needs to be.
And again, one of the things that it helps set up is this idea of the truth of the gospel relates to both idolatry. I think everybody can see that, but also the truth of the gospel, you say, cuts to the root of idleness, because as you quote from the Dutch theologian Abraham Kuyper, who said, there's not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mind. The point is that every aspect of our life needs to come under the lordship of Jesus Christ. And so there is a tendency today, Sebastian, I'm sure you would agree with this, of people having kind of this sacred secular dichotomy, that the sacred is what I do at church, maybe even how I raise my kids, but then I leave that behind as I go into the boardroom, the classroom, the newsroom, whatever it might be, because I do not see how Christianity relates to my work. And your book is really an attempt to help people make that connection, isn't it?
It is. And so, I mean, let me give an example of this. So when I was 18 years old, I started one of my first companies, actually maybe a little earlier, 16, and it was basically sealing decks. And, when I sealed a deck, I was kind of very proud of how fast and how quickly and how, easily I could do that and how much money I could make in as little time. That was really what my driving goal was. It wasn't, how can I image and represent God best? How can I show the world that God is an excellent worker, that the energy and the ethic that he goes about his work is different, right? Is what's created the world. Well, in one of these decks that I sealed, I still remember this guy kind of called me over and he said, "Hey, come over and check out this deck that you sealed." And I looked at it and I thought, "Oh, this is great. It looks beautiful." And he's like, "Yeah, that's right. Look at the spindles, the poles. Look how nice those are. That's right. They look great." He's like, "That's right. Let me just come over and look at one more thing." And there I come over and he rolls away a potted plant, and underneath it was an unsealed deck, right? I hadn't even taken the time in my haste for making money or my haste for going fast. I wasn't thinking about serving him. I wasn't thinking about imaging and representing the Lord. I was just thinking about how quickly can I do this and how much can I make doing it. And I think that example, again, you're not going to be as immature as I was as a 16-year-old maybe, but I think a lot of us detach what it means to be a Christian from the excellence, the ethics, the way we go about our work. And so this book is really a call for people to examine their hearts and ask, listen, if you are not working in a way that is honoring the King, we think that should be the highest motivation you possibly have, doing work for the King. And so we want to encourage Christians to do their work with the excellence, the ethic, and all their ability as befitting the King of Kings.
Well, again, the idea there is that you work unto the Lord. You work for Jesus, as you say. And you even talk about the fact that working for Jesus gives you freedom to worship God through your work. Working for Jesus gives you the freedom to serve others. Working for Jesus gives you the freedom to trust God in your work. And working for Jesus gives you freedom to rest from your work, as well as gives you freedom to do your work well and to have joy in your work. So there is a sense in which once you get the attitude right, all sorts of other things fall into place, don't they?
They sure do. So even going back to your example you gave about men's conferences where people had to kind of introduce themselves
Yes.
without saying what they did, I think about that. One of the more profound things I learned in writing this book, and it's in there, is a simple phrase that I think really summarizes a ton in my mind of some of the challenges we find. And that phrase is, who you work for is more important than what you do. So who you work for is more important than what you do. And so much of our culture and our own hearts are tied up in the what we do. It's almost like we think to ourselves, who cares if I'm really a Christian? Who cares if the King of the universe has redeemed me? What's really important is the kind of job that I get, or the kind of work that I do, or how quickly I can do my work, or any of those types of things. And we really think that's got to be flipped around. What's really unique is the fact that the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, has redeemed you, has given you a new life and a new heart. And if that is set and secure, and that's your identity, then all of a sudden, almost any work that you do is an incredible opportunity to make much of that King.
Let's, if we can, maybe answer that question that is in the minds of especially some of the young people listening over the summer. Maybe some thinking about graduating and what they might do, because you have a chapter there on how should I choose a job, because first of all, the motivation is important. It all, as you said, doesn't even matter what kind of job you have if you have the right motivation. But once you have the right motivation, there are some choices that people can make. To take a bizarre example, yes, you can work under the Lord as a thief or as a pimp or a variety of other things, but that's not honoring to the Lord. So it is more than just the right attitude. It's also the selecting those particular ways in which you can use the gifts and abilities and various aspects of God making you to actually use that in a way through your job that glorifies Him. So how do we go through that particular choice? Because it's important to find the right job and the right way in which you can use the gifts that God has given to you.
Absolutely. Well, Kerby, again, we want to make sure this book is, and it's just positive. We want people to live fulfilled lives under the Lord and find purpose and meaning in their jobs. Interestingly, though, we would say the way you do that is, again, first recognizing that it's the Lord who all of your work is for. So really what you're doing is not as much choosing a job as you are discovering, okay, what assignment does the Lord have for me? What is it that He would have me to do? And as you go through that process, we recommend, or we, in our book, we talk about really breaking that into kind of two different buckets as you think about it. One is must-haves. What are the must-haves biblically for choosing a job? What are the things that the Bible says really have to be true of it? And then secondarily, what are the nice-to-haves? So must-haves, those are the things that, like, I really have to get right. And the nice-to-haves are exactly that. If I can get them, that's great. So we would say the must-haves, just three simple questions. Does a particular job glorify God? And praise God, honestly, if your job is not causing you to, it's not specific sin, and it's not causing you to sin, there's so many things that can glorify God. As you serve your neighbor, as you love your neighbor through your work, as you serve and support bosses and others, so many things can glorify God. Second question is, does it permit me to live a godly life? So in taking on this job, am I tempted to shirk other responsibilities I have? Or is it allowing me to invest in other ways, in my family, in my church, in my community? Or is it kind of forcing me to again, be idle in some of those responsibilities? And then does it provide for my needs, right? Does it allow me to make money and support myself and be a blessing to my family and others? Those are kind of the biblical must-haves. And so we counsel everyone, make sure those three things are true. A job glorifies God, permits you to live a godly life, and then provides for your needs. After that, you have tremendous freedom in the nice-to-haves, tremendous freedom, because Scripture actually doesn't tell you have to do anything else. And so every other person, if you're kind of caught in a situation where you're trying to choose between things, our thought is make sure the must-haves are there, and then if you can get the nice-to-haves, have them. And those are things like, does it benefit society? Does it allow you to kind of be a blessing to others? Can you do it well? Obviously, take into account what you're good at. And then do you want to do it? Do you have a desire for it? So these are, again, we'd say absolutely go for them, but just don't get crippled in indecision or kind of keep waiting forever if you never find those nice-to-haves.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, let's take some phone calls, too. Perhaps you have a comment or a question. You wonder, can I really share the gospel in my work? How do I handle a difficult boss or coworker? Is full-time ministry maybe more valuable than my secular job? These are questions that are addressed in the book, but perhaps you have some similar kinds of questions. We are privileged to talk with Sebastian today, and the book is entitled The Gospel at Work. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Sebastian Traeger. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Again, your work matters to God. We'd love to know your thoughts about how to apply biblical principles to your work, and we're going to get into some of these practical questions, which are all found in the book, The Gospel at Work. Came out a number of years ago, but now this one is updated and expanded. You can find a copy in your local bookstore, or, of course, it is published by Zondervan. We have a link there as well. Let's, if we can, get into some of those. One of those is the issue of balance. Just so happens this Sunday I'm going to be speaking in my Sunday school class about the issue of balance, because so often there's a kind of a, what about a work-life balance, a balance between work, church, and family? One of your chapters addresses that issue, and talk through some of the principles that we need to understand there to begin to have a balance that honors God.
Yeah, this question, I think, is one that is just immediately applicable to everybody, right? Most people either feel like their head's underwater. I think that's probably the majority of people. Obviously, some probably feel like I've got extra margin, extra bandwidth. What can I do with it? And I would say the key principle to think about here is that nowhere in the Bible are we actually called to a life of balance. Actually, Christians are called to live a sold-out life to Christ. And we see that, right, where Jesus basically says, seek him first and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you, right? Seek first the kingdom of God. That's what we are to be sold out for. We are to be sold out for Christ and for the kingdom. And so then the question really becomes a question of, how do I organize all those other assignments God has given me, from work to family, whether I'm single or married with children, to church? How do I now think through all these different assignments and make sure they're all focused on that one overarching goal, which is to live a life sold out to the Lord Jesus? And so the way we would say to do that is to kind of look at those secondary assignments, and rather than looking at how your friends are living, even your Christian friends, recognize that all of us are wired very differently. We have different levels of energy. We have different capacities, abilities, family histories, responsibilities. We all have so many different things going on in our lives. And so it really requires us, not all by ourselves, but in community with others, to look at what does the Bible define as the responsibilities as a church member, the responsibilities in family, the responsibilities in the workplace. And then how do I compare to those, what the Bible defines as what faithfulness looks like? How am I doing on kind of that faithfulness scorecard? That's what we think is the best way to look at this question. Think to yourself, I need to be sold out for Christ, and I need to be faithful in these different assignments. First, evaluate, what does faithfulness look like biblically? How am I doing? And to the extent I see ways where I'm not living faithfully, I need to repent of those, and I need to start living faithfully in those areas. And to the extent that I am living faithfully in all these areas, start praying, okay, God, where can I invest more energies, more resources in which of these responsibilities or assignments that you've given me? So when we think about balance, that's the key thing we want to get across to people.
And again, it's the idea of faithfulness and fruitfulness. And again, some great material in the book, The Gospel at Work. Let's take some phone calls, and this one I think will lead us into one of the other chapters in the book. And we'll go to Pamela in Texas. You're on with Sebastian Traeger.
Good afternoon, Sebastian.
Hi, Pamela.
I'm enjoying your topic on today. And I usually listen to this station when I get a chance. I enjoy you, Kerby.
Thank you. So what's your comment for us today?
Yes, my comment is that as a Christian, I'll give you an example of myself. When I started to working for this company, I said, Lord, let me reach everybody in this company from headquarters to the janitor. I thought it meant that I was going to, be promoted. But it so happened that the Lord worked that out by them always lying on me so that management, top management, came down to investigate me. And so my method of preaching the gospel when I wasn't on break or, just working was singing praises to God. And we worked I worked the graveyard shift. And in the wee hours of the morning, I just start out singing, and I said I was waking the people up so they could work. And they allowed me to do that for 27 years.
Let's talk about that, because that really gets us into the chapter there, I would have to say, Sebastian, about how can I share the gospel at work? Now, she found an opportunity at a graveyard shift. Singing in the daytime might be a little tougher, but what about that? Because it does seem to me that we have to be careful, because obviously we are to honor the employer. And we've talked with Kelly Shackelford and others at First Liberty about the rights that Christians have in the workplace. But again, there's some biblical principles that we can use as we talk about in Chapter 9, how we share the gospel. So share those, if you might, with us.
Absolutely. And Pamela, I just praise God for your desire and your prayers that God would use you in the workplace. I think that's where, to some extent, we've got to start when we think about evangelism in the workplace. Christians should evangelize in the workplace for one simple reason, and that is, as a Christian, you're also an ambassador. And so you're always an ambassador, right? Whatever you're doing, wherever you are, whatever sphere of life, and you're always a representative of the Lord Jesus Christ. And part of that is proclaiming the gospel. Now, one area where I do think, and I just think we have to recognize that being an evangelist in the workplace does not always mean it's appropriate to be an evangelist during the, quote, 9 to 5, right? Employers are paying you for your time to do work for them. Some workplaces have cultures or downtime where it's absolutely fine to have conversations about other things. Other companies, I don't think, do. And honestly, I don't think that should bother you in the least at all. Your conscience should be clear. If you're in a workplace where it's just not appropriate to ever speak about the gospel, I don't think that should bother you. Unless, here's the big unless, what I would recommend is think about how can you be building gospel relationships in the workplace. So how can you be building good relationships in the workplace through the way you work, through the way you're a good friend to people, through the way you serve other people, through the way you just make it known that you're a Christian. All of these different ways allow you to build relationships, and then invite people to breakfast ahead of work, to lunch during the day, to dinner afterwards. If you're working a graveyard shift, offer to give somebody a ride home. There's so many different ways to spend time with people who you meet at work that don't happen on kind of company time or company ground. And so I would say, listen, if you're being proactive in thinking about creative ways you can invite people to engage in conversations and just get to know them as a friend outside of work, I would say I would not be worried if you're in a workplace where communicating the gospel message is just not as appropriate.
And one of the things you talk about is do good work as a Christian. Sometimes when I speak to young people going off to college, I say, you've got an opportunity sometimes to share your faith in a classroom where it's appropriate, or even as you write a paper to your professor. But you're going to have a lot more credibility if you're doing good work in the classroom. If you are never perceived as ever asking a question, never really contributing to the conversation, if you never get a good grade on any of your papers, you're not going to have the same kind of opportunity to share your faith. The same thing is when people look around and they say, Bob over there, he's a really good worker, and turns out he's a Christian. Well, that's even more. I'd like to know a little bit more about him versus, well, Joe over there, he just seems to be always taking a break and never really too interested in the company, and he doesn't really have good work habits. Your testimony is both verbal and also in terms of lifestyle. So recognize that if you're going to really be effective in terms of evangelism, you're going to have to not only model what you are talking about, but also be able to verbalize it in a way that makes a difference. So that's just another one of those principles in the book that I think people are going to find very helpful. We come back from the break. Let's, if we can, get into a couple of other issues. We talked about maybe the issue of balance in the workplace. We've talked a little bit about how to share the gospel. But how do we handle a difficult boss or a difficult coworker? Or what does it mean to be a Christian boss? Maybe you're in a position of leadership. Can you apply Christian principles of leadership in your work? And there are so many great chapters as well as appendices in this book. And each one of those ends with a for further reflection that gives you some scripture passages as well as some suggested questions. So we think this would be a great book, not only for individual study, but for small group study as well. So we'll get back into some of those practical questions that are addressed in the book. It's published by Zondervan. Look for it in your local bookstore. We also have a link on our website, pointofview.net. Stay tuned. We'll have more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Sebastian Traeger with us for a few more minutes as we talk about the book, The Gospel at Work, published by Zondervan, and lots of practical chapters, including this one, How Do I Handle Difficult Bosses and Coworkers? Just a minute, we might also talk about what it means to be a Christian boss, but everybody has a story. As a matter of fact, Sebastian, if you just go into a lunchroom at noon or a restaurant at noon, you will hear all sorts of coworkers talking about their boss and how obnoxious he or she is, or one of these coworkers. I mean, it is amazing if you just listen at a restaurant or a cafeteria or something like that, because they spend a fair amount of time talking about these difficult people that we have to work with. And because we have to work with them and we can't leave them unless we leave the job, This is why you've put that chapter in there to begin to help us think through how we begin to address that issue. So give us a couple of pointers.
Sure. And again, it goes without saying, anybody who works anywhere is going to have some level of frustration in the workplace. Why? Because we have to remember, expectations as Christians are, God created work to be a good thing where work and worship are linked together. Because of the fall, God cursed our work, and so our work is never going to live up to the expectations that we want for them. And one of the ways we experience that is just through difficult relationships in the workplace. It's going to happen. I think in this point, we have to start by just remembering that God is the one, again, who assigns us our work. Now, I think that's a very freeing thing to recognize. Hey, listen, if I have a difficult boss or a difficult coworker, that's all under God's sovereignty. He knows exactly that that's an assignment that he's given me. It's an assignment actually for my good and my sanctification so that I can grow to be more Christ-like as I recognize what it looks like to submit to authority or work aside people who are difficult. I will say, just as a practical point, and there's other things I can say, but probably for me personally, one of the most helpful things I have done whenever I've had a difficult boss or a difficult coworker is pray for that person regularly. It is incredible when you start to pray for somebody, and don't pray one of those like, God, I pray you change this person to be exactly like I want them to be, but instead literally pray for that person. Pray for them to find joy in the workplace. Pray for them in their family. Pray for them to grow in character. Pray for them to enjoy what they're doing. All these good ways that you start to pray for them, I just think God uses that to really change our hearts as we relate to other people that we find difficult.
The flip side of that is, what does it mean to be a Christian boss? Now, one of the things you quote from is Jim Collins' Good to Great, which, by the way, is a great book that I would recommend. But this requires us then to maybe apply some of these biblical principles about leadership as well as biblical principles about authority.
Yeah, if you're in a position where you are a boss, recognize that the authority that you have is authority that effectively has been given to you by the Lord. And the Lord, who kind of grants you that authority, effectively says, I'm delegating some of my authority to you. What's the purpose of that authority you have? Well, yes, on one level it is to get that widget made or that coffee served or that brief written. Absolutely, there's that functional part. But even bigger than that, you've been delegated that authority so that you can show your coworkers, a watching world, honestly, the angels in heaven, this is what God's authority is like. Watch how I steward authority, because I'm trying to steward it in the same way that God stewards authority. And then we see all kinds of ways biblically that God is kind with authority. He serves and blesses others with his authority, right? He is sacrificial, we see in authority. Obviously, our authority should imitate Christ. We see all these ways biblically that our authority can now image and represent the God who delegates it to us. Just a high challenge, I would say, for any boss. So I just want to encourage you in that if you are a boss.
Let's, if we can, just focus for a second on this idea of calling before we run out of time. And you've got a chapter there on full-time ministry. Is that more valuable than my job? Or even, am I called to my job? There's this idea, Sebastian, sometimes that, well, there's a calling to ministry, but there's not a calling to our jobs. And that's something that you really address as well in the book.
We do, and this is a topic that I'm passionate about. Obviously, everything in this book, but when we think about calling, I think oftentimes we can think of it as kind of the quote one big thing I'm supposed to do, and really what we want to do is help people see that calling is really a collection of the abilities, the opportunities, the desires, all of these things. Effectively, what you're doing right now is what God has called you to do right now, to exercise your abilities in that assignment for the glory of God. And so to ask the question, well, is full-time ministry more valuable than my job? We'd almost say, well, no, absolutely it's not. Yes, there's a specialness to preaching the gospel and communicating the word, but no, every one of us has an individual assignment that God has given us. And we want to encourage people, rather than constantly thinking, is there a better assignment for me or is that assignment better? We want to encourage people to be faithful in the assignment that God has given them. We think that's the more foundational question, which is, am I being faithful with the responsibilities, with the opportunities, with the abilities, and the desires that the Lord has given me?
So again, just great material in this book. Just before we go, let's talk about how people can use the various chapters as well as the appendices. You have 5 practices to help you live out the gospel at work. We already mentioned a biblical theology of work, as well as some other material that you have in the book on how to leverage your job for the nations. So there's a lot of great material, but just give us an idea of how this might be used in a small group setting if somebody would like to begin to teach that and gather together others to begin to think about how to apply a biblical perspective to their work.
Sure. If you go to our website, thegospelwork.com, there are basically, we've taken the book and we've broken it into 6 different units effectively, so that whether you're teaching it in a small group or a Sunday school class, you can effectively lead your church or your group through that and help them think through some of these principles. We think it's great to either hand out the book ahead of time or to encourage people to read that so they come in prepared. We think that's a really useful way to go through it. You can check out our website, thegospelatwork.com. The other thing I would say is a lot of people have read this book with one other person or 2 other people. And so we think reading groups is another great way to go through it, where effectively you just each read a chapter or 2. The book is designed to be a pretty quick read. Each chapter is only 10 or 15 minutes of reading, and then there's some discussion questions so that you can really kind of talk it through and think through how you're learning and what you're learning from it.
And again, let me just mention that at the website there, which we have a link to, the various resources, some videos, and other material at thegospelatwork.com. Of course, we also have a link to the International Mission Board, and of course, we have information on our website for this book. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we've got it very easy for you to find the link and to use in your study. And I hope that you'll not only read it yourself, but maybe consider putting together a small group to address those issues. So again, Sebastian, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View, and thank you for writing the book.
Well, Kerby, it has been a joy. Thank you for such great questions, and I really appreciated the opportunity to share some of these ideas with your audience.
Well, again, outstanding resource. And again, let me encourage you to get a copy of the book, Forward by David Platt, which I quoted from as well, The Gospel at Work, How the Gospel Gives New Purpose and Meaning to Our Jobs. You would spend as much as 80,000 hours at work. Does a Christian viewpoint have any relevance there? Of course it does. And so this is a resource we want to put in your hands. And I mentioned while you go to the website, there are just all sorts of resources that we oftentimes talk about that are available to you. And I hope you'll take advantage of, for example, downloading the podcast or watching the program again, passing it on to others. But most importantly, let me just emphasize how we do need your financial support. So if you can help us out, just click on that button that says donate. That would be a way in which you could help us financially. Do need to take a break, though, and we'll come back with more right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about American history. And about a month ago, I saw a really good piece that appeared in National Review by Jay Cost entitled Hamilton, Madison, and the Paradox at America's Heart. And it was all about his new book, The Price of Greatness: Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and the Creation of American Oligarchy. So I thought, well, that's a good piece. I'm going to do some commentaries on it. And I thought, I'm going to buy the book. And then I even told my son-in-law, who's a lawyer and has 2 PhDs, one in American history where he's taught that, why doesn't he get the book as well? So when the book arrived, I said, we got to see if it's even possible we could put him on Point of View and educate all of us about this issue. And it is just a great opportunity to bring Jay Cost to the microphone today. Individual that has been a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, probably best known as the senior writer at the Weekly Standard. Also has written for the Wall Street Journal, National Review, commentary, a number of others, but and an individual that also, interestingly enough, holds a PhD in political philosophy from the University of Chicago and has done us a great service of helping us understand 2 individuals with very different views for America, which in many cases is being played out today. So, Dr. Cost, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
One of the things that is kind of interesting is because of that 2004 biography by Ron Chernow, you've had a lot of people interested in Alexander Hamilton. Of course, you have the Broadway play or musical Hamilton. As a matter of fact, my producer was just talking about having an ability to get tickets to that. So we are sort of getting a revival in which people are paying attention to James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. And at a time when we're trying to figure out where America goes in the 21st century, I think your book arrived at a very propitious time.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's nice to see Hamilton finally get his due. He had been really kind of forgotten for over 100 years as a founding father. He ended up being on the, he died, was assassinated or killed in a duel in 1804, and his political opponents really kind of ended up taking over the country. And his reputation had really sunk until relatively recently. So it's really nice to see Hamilton finally be appreciated once more as the really brilliant founding father that he was.
Well, I want to get into the idea of self-government and republicanism and a variety of other issues, but for just a minute, let's just give a brief overview for both of those individuals, because if you read the Federalist Papers, and when I was at Georgetown, that was one of the things we had to read almost with the same kind of scrutiny that you'd read the Bible. Most of those were written by Alexander Hamilton, many others written by James Madison, and then a few written by John Jay, although because he was sick didn't write as many. But these are 2 individuals that in some respects, just because of their presence at the Constitutional Convention, being around people like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and others, certainly were key. And yet, as you point out, sometimes they get ignored over time because we focus on other individuals. And yet, if you really want to understand why the Constitution is the way it is, I would recommend that you want to read the Federalist Papers by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, don't you think?
I do. Madison and Hamilton were both born in the 1750s. So Madison was born in 1751. Hamilton was born in 1756. Now, if you compare the two of them to, Thomas Jefferson was born in the 1740s and George Washington was born in the 1730s. Benjamin Franklin was born even earlier, so was John Adams and Samuel Adams. So Hamilton and Madison are both young men. They're in this sort of the second generation of the founding. And they're too young. Both of them are too young to be involved in the lead up to independence. But Madison is not physically. He's only 5 foot 4 inches and 120 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
He's really no kind of soldier. Hamilton ends up being George Washington's aide de camp, but doesn't take a leadership role in the military, something like a Nathaniel Greene or something like that. So the two of them are really, I don't want to say second-tier founders, but just sort of chronologically, I suppose they were. So they're easy to overlook. It's easy to sort of look at them or sort of look at George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and miss the two of them. But you're right. They had a very crucial role in not so much in bringing about the revolution, but securing the revolution, which is what the Constitution did.
Yeah, I like to make a distinction between the founders and the framers, and in some respects they were more the framers. Well, if we can, for just a few minutes, since I think many people know something about Hamilton, if nothing else because of the musical, he was unusual in the sense that he was not born in this country, and yet nevertheless came from a rather difficult set of circumstances to be fairly successful. Tell the rest of the story, if you might.
Yeah, well, so he was born in very unfortunate circumstances. He was an illegitimate child, born in the Caribbean. His mother dies when he's very young, but he is a very, very bright individual, and he gets a job as a clerk. And his fellow islanders on the island of Nevis take up a collection basically to send him to King's College in New York, which is present-day Columbia. And he immigrates to New York and joins the revolutionary cause. And Hamilton, being Hamilton, is very quickly discovered basically by George Washington, who appreciates how essential he is. And so Hamilton ends up serving as Washington's aide de camp, and simultaneously in the process of that really ends up sort of educating himself on matters of public finance and develops a very nationalistic outlook on the future of the country, having seen the difficulties of mobilizing a military force among the 13 often fractious states. So Hamilton becomes a key leader of the push for a stronger national union after the Treaty of Paris is signed in 1783, and the country is internationally recognized.
Well, and again, very important kind of background to Alexander Hamilton. We're going to get into the National Bank and some of that and where he and Madison disagree, but I have one of those mandatory breaks. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about James Madison as well. As you said, born in 1751 in a family with kind of a fairly large estate in Virginia. Went to the College of New Jersey, and anybody that's listened to some of my presentations, we've talked about that today, is present-day Princeton. And really was influenced by somebody that we've talked about before, and that is the individual who was the president, but also a Scottish Presbyterian minister by the name of John Witherspoon. And many people think that a lot of that Calvinism caused James Madison to consider the need for us to have checks and balances. And if you read Federalist Paper number 10 or Federalist Paper number 51, you would certainly come to some of that conclusion. And then we'll talk about, of course, Alexander Hamilton, who also wrote about the judiciary, and at a time when we talk about the confirmation of another Supreme Court justice, a lot of people go back to Federalist Paper number 78 and others. So there are just a lot of things that, even though we'll be talking about what happened in the 18th century, are very relevant to some of the debates we're having today in the 21st century, which is why I certainly do recommend this book, which I went out and bought, and my son-in-law did as well, and I think you should, because it is published by Basic Books. You probably can find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link to jcost.com. We've got information about the book there, and of course we've also got a place for you to order it. And of course we've posted this article that appeared in National Review, Hamilton, Madison, and the Paradox at America's Heart. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A columnist named Virginia is facing a dilemma. She lives in Brooklyn Heights and doesn't know what to make of her neighbor who recently plowed her driveway without being asked. The neighbors are what she calls Trumpites, and she is a Harvard-educated liberal journalist. Rod Dreher writes about this because normal people don't have a problem with such an act of kindness, no matter who provides it. She, on the other hand, says it's kind of weird. Back in the city, people don't sweep other people's walkways for nothing. Then she wondered if the neighbors heard Senator Ben Sasse suggest that we clean another neighbor's walk. That's it. They were probably trying to make a bid for reconciliation, she concluded, and she added they probably aren't even looking for absolution anyway. Rod Dreher observes, let me tell you something, Virginia. Your neighbors probably have no idea who Ben Sasse is and isn't looking to reconcile with you, much less receive your absolution. They wanted to do something nice for you because you are their neighbor, and that's what neighbors do for each other. The fact that you assume there must be some politically aware motive behind the action says a lot about you. He tries to explain to her that most people in America will do nice things for friends and neighbors without stopping to ask about their politics. In a small town, the guy you'll need to call to saw up the tree that fell across your driveway might have MAGA and NRA stickers on his truck. He might also do it for free because he knows you've been sick and have medical bills. You know, it's a sad commentary that Virginia and so many other liberals like her failed the snowplow test. They can't set aside their politics and their suspicion. Plowing snow, raking leaves, mowing lawns for others, that's what neighbors do. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Jay Costin. Again, he is the author of this new book, The Price of Greatness, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and the Creation of American Oligarchy. It's published by Basic Books, over 200 pages. And again, if you'd like to know more about that, we have a link, first of all, to a way in which you could order the book. Again, it is available both in hardcover and Kindle, eventually probably even in paperback. And then we also have a link to jcost.com for more information about him and the book and other resources. And Jay, let's, if we can, come back. I talked a little bit about James Madison, but you probably can do a better job of giving us some education about an individual that also was very important and is oftentimes referred to as the architect of the Constitution.
Yes, Madison was, like we discussed before the break, born in 1751. And so that really, he's really kind of in college when the major events that lead up to the American Revolution begin to happen. So things like the Stamp Act. And he really doesn't have much of an interest in politics, frankly, until the Boston Tea Party and the so-called Intolerable Acts of 1774 really activates something inside of him. And he moves very quickly from that point. He gets elected to the Virginia legislature, where he falls into the orbit of a governor that you might have heard of, Thomas Jefferson.
Yes.
And Madison is really distinguishes himself almost from the very beginning as being an advocate for religious liberty. And particularly what was going on in Virginia during this period is you have the established Church of Virginia was the Anglican Church, the Church of Virginia, and the government was really sort of prosecuting religious minorities, particularly the Baptists that had sort of the Baptist movement that had come about as a consequence of the Great Awakening.
Right.
And Madison is, he grows up in the Anglican Church, but he goes to the College of New Jersey, which is run, as you said, by John Witherspoon, who was a Presbyterian. And one of the reasons for that is that he was really put off by the loose morals and kind of corrupt attitude and sort of the laxity of the Anglican-run College of William and Mary. So he's an Anglican, but he's not really a very good Anglican. He has a lot of sympathy for Baptist minorities, and it's Madison and Jefferson who really begin the push for religious liberty in the state of Virginia to disestablish the Anglican Church and make sure that people are free to follow their consciences and worship God as their consciences dictate.
And again, that's important because we so often talk about religious liberty with Kelly Shackelford and Jay Sekulow and others, and we go oftentimes back to individuals like James Madison. Let's, if we can, though, if we don't want to run out of time, talk about the things that Madison and Hamilton agreed about. Early on in your book, you talk about three. First, a commitment to liberal government. By that, the liberal idea was this idea of individual rights and what was actually described in the Declaration of Independence as unalienable rights. And both Madison and Hamilton believe that we have unalienable rights that were endowed to us by our Creator.
Yeah, that's right. This was a general consensus that was widely held at the time, the idea that government was primarily created by free and equal human beings for the protection of their rights. So above all, the right to property. This was just sort of an essential kind of understanding that really linked all Americans and really most people in the English-speaking world. I mean, it's important to bear in mind that the American Revolution was, in many respects, a conservative revolution because it was really about the colonists arguing that their rights as Englishmen, as subjects of the British Crown, had been violated, and they had been left with no recourse but to declare their independence.
And so that was the first one. The other one was this idea of what's called republicanism or self-government, and that is, again, something which we take for granted. But when you assume that King George, the crown, the parliament had the rights, this idea of self-government, it itself was a pretty radical idea, wasn't it?
Yes, this is where the American colonists were more radical. Self-governance or republicanism, I think, is kind of a nebulous concept, but Abraham Lincoln, I think, sums it up well in the Gettysburg Address. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And the really big giant leap that the colonists and then the Americans make is eliminating a hereditary monarchy, right? So the people alone are the fount of sovereignty, because in England, the people ruled through the House of Commons, but they ruled in conjunction with the British sovereign, who was a hereditary monarch and claimed direct authority from God. And the American Revolution was radical in the sense that it got rid of the notion of a hereditary sovereign and instead founded governmental authority solely on the people.
And again, I might point you to a July 2nd commentary by Jay Coss called "The Declaration of Independence was more radical than any of the men who signed it." And so we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later if we have some time. But the first point was, of course, this idea of liberal government. Second of all, in terms of republicanism. By the way, all those terms have been redefined, but again, those were the original terms. But the third was that they were nationalist, and you've already sort of alluded to that a little bit, and that is especially Alexander Hamilton, but I think James Madison as well, felt that this is just not working. 13 independent states, even under the Articles of Confederation, it didn't work. And so if you wanted to actually promote the ideas of liberalism and republicanism, that's only going to be secured if you have a national government. That's
right. And sitting in the background here is an anxiety that not just that the government isn't working, right? That the national government is basically can't do anything. And so the 13 state governments are in charge. And they're really not well-run governments. They oppress political minorities. They interfere with the rights and privileges of each other. So one of the key anxieties in the background here of men like Madison and Hamilton is that it's only a matter of time before the 13 states actually turn against each other, and we get, wars on the North American continent like what Europe had been plagued by. And additionally, or I should say relatedly, is that the European powers were still operating within the North American continent. You have England to the north and in the Old Northwest. You have Spain in control of Florida. You have the French around as well. And there was an anxiety that the United States, unless they forged a stronger union, would just be manipulated persistently, the 13 states being manipulated by these European powers and being made to sort of dance the tune that's called by Europe.
Yes. And when we come back from the break, I certainly want to focus on the places where Madison and Hamilton disagreed. But since we're talking about that, another term I might put on the table for just a few minutes, and we do have about 2 minutes left. You had the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. Now, they agreed in the principles here of liberalism and republicanism, but they disagreed as to kind of what you might say the nature of the Union. You know, the Anti-Federalists were saying, look, we just got rid of the crown. We just got rid of England. We don't want to have another national government. So Patrick Henry, whoever you might want to pick, have some difficulties there. So they agreed on the goal, that is liberalism, republicanism, self-government, individual rights, but they disagreed about how strong the national government should be, because at least some of them did not want to repeat what they just had thrown off in a revolution.
Yeah, that's right. And there were very prominent anti-federalists. James Monroe, 5th President of the United States. You mentioned Patrick Henry, and also Governor George Clinton of New York, who ends up being vice president. So very, very prominent anti-federalists, but also sort of suggests the reconciliation that happens after the Constitution, right, where the anti-federalists don't become like insurgents or insurrectionists. Like the debate between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists is actually really pretty civil. And so the Constitution, insofar as it was a revolution, it was not a revolution that ate its own. Very important development for the long-term stability of the United States of America. So the Anti-Federalists were welcomed back into the fold, and the disagreement was heated but respectful and ultimately civil.
Yeah, a civil dialogue. What a concept. We need some of that today. Let's take a break. When we come back, we will get into the disagreements. And these are not only 18th century disagreements, some of those surface even to this day. What about Hamilton's idea of national vigor and a strong national government and a national bank even? What about Madison's idea of a Republican balance? And so we're trying to help you understand that some of the tension and the paradox and the disagreement that surfaced even in the latter part of the 18th century is really still part of our political debate today. But we need to take a break, and if you'd like to know a little bit more about this new book, The Price of Greatness, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and the Creation of American Oligarchy, you can probably find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we have information about that on our website. We also have a link to jcost.com, and there's information there as well, including many of his articles, some of which, of course, we've posted on our website today, Point of View. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Jay Koss as we talk about his book, The Price of Greatness, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and the Creation of American Oligarchy. And Jay, if we can for just a minute, let's focus on the differences between Hamilton and Madison. And in your chapter, you talk about Hamilton's program for really national vigor, but probably the best illustration I can give is just this idea of a national bank. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, for example, didn't really think that a national bank was even allowed in the Constitution, but Alexander Hamilton was looking at the Bank of England creating money and the importance of commerce, and he believed that that should be established. And of course, as Secretary of Treasury, actually brought it about. But talk about his vision for the government and his vision for this idea of what you call national vigor.
Right. Well, the way to understand where Hamilton is coming from with the bank is to borrow a concept from modern language, which would be basically a public-private partnership, is what the national bank represented. So the public side of the bank is that the government would store its tax revenues in the bank, in the vaults of the bank, and also the government would expect the bank to be there to loan the government money in a pinch. And these are very important things the bank offered. But the bank otherwise would be a private entity engaging in private economic ventures owned by private citizen stockholders, right? So Madison has sort of two objections to this. The first is that, hey, this isn't fair for most Americans. The stockholders of the bank are going to be a very narrow slice of the country, mainly from the commercial centers in the Northeast. And because the government is going to store its tax revenues there, it's basically going to be a guaranteed moneymaker. The bank is never going to want for money, so it will be able to make a profit very easily. So how is that fair? And Madison also was worried about the entanglement of public business and private interest.
Yes.
That he did not see this as a one-way street. If the government comes to depend upon the private stockholders of the bank to hold their currency and to loan them money, that gives the stockholders power over the government, that in a Republican form of government really should be held by the people alone. Hamilton, on the other hand, was comfortable with this and was right to recognize the need for an institution like this, in the sense that he understood that the wealthy in the country were going to be making a bet on the success of the United States one way or another. And if the government could find a way to sort of effectively capture their self-interest and yoke it to the interests of the good of the entire country, then they would make a bet on the success of the United States. So imagine, for instance, without the bank, the United States government would not be able to borrow money at reasonable rates of interest. I mean, so you could imagine a situation like we had in Greece a couple years ago, where, interest rates are out of control and the government can't borrow money, and people lose even more faith in the government, so interest rates go up, and you just sort of get this vicious cycle. Hamilton saw a private bank that held public tax revenues as a way to create a virtuous cycle, confidence in the government facilitating lower interest rates and governmental success, and therefore, in the long run, greater confidence in the government.
And again, Madison, as you just pointed out a minute ago, felt that, government should be more like an umpire or a judge or referee or something like that. It shouldn't get involved in some of those activities, and also was really concerned about the fact that it would help the wealthy, but not those who were not landowners, those who were not as entitled and endowed as others. And isn't that just, if nothing else, a kind of a quick summary of some of the conflict we have today over public policy? Because you'll have, on one hand, individuals that will say, we need to do something with, for example, the most recent tax reform to actually stimulate the economy. But then people say, well, the people that are the primary beneficiaries are those in the upper income tiers in terms of some kind of tax reform. But then you have others that say, yeah, but I've never seen a job created by a person that isn't wealthy. But at the same time, others are saying, well, yeah, but it benefits those who are wealthy, but not the general population. And so it's not like one was right or the other was wrong. in some respects, it's the illustration of the clash of values we have even to this very day, don't you think?
I do, and I think that its clash of values, it continues to resonate through to today because these values are inherent in our constitutional structure. I mean, they're all there in the preamble. We, the people of the United States, which is a very Republican statement, in order to form a more perfect union, which is a very nationalistic statement, right? So we, on the one hand, want to be a government of the people, by the people, for the people, so we treat different classes of citizens equitably and without distinction. At least that's what we aspire to. But we also recognize that we want to grow and develop and become a better nation, a more prosperous, a more secure nation. And frankly, that often requires us to play favorites. And, you know, so the reason that I titled the book The Price of Greatness is because there are real trade-offs between becoming a greater nation or more developed, secure, prosperous nation on the one hand, and following through on, again, this idea espoused by Lincoln, a government of the people, by the people, for the people.
Okay, let's get to the subtitle, Oligarchy. You end up with sort of a hybrid here. You've got the economics of Alexander Hamilton. You've got kind of the political civics of James Madison. But you end up with an oligarchy, or you end up at least a few times where that develops. Can you kind of give us some illustrations of that?
Sure. Well, an oligarchy is sort of derived from Greek. It basically means rule by the wealthy, right? And inevitably it comes about because, at least in the American context, you know, if we're going to use certain groups as mediators of the public good, like you talked about tax cuts a little bit ago, you know, those are going to be tax cuts, you know, because we want to create jobs, so they're going to accrue primarily to the wealthy, right? But beyond that, you know, by giving direct benefits to the wealthy, like Hamilton did with the bank, kind of ends up entangling American interest and the interest of the rich. So you see this in, you know, the massive lobbying operations that exist in Washington, D.C. today, usually working on behalf of some very powerful, wealthy interest group. So there's and it's not just a one-way distribution of benefits or one-sided distribution, but also entanglement of public power and private interest. And, you know, this is, as you suggested, Kerby, this has happened through various points in American history. I think one of the more recent examples would be the illustration of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, where the federal government gets involved in promoting affordable housing, which is a good thing, right? Home ownership is a good thing. If anybody in the audience owns their own home, you appreciate how much more valuable it is to own your own home than to rent. So the federal government gets involved in this and basically starts spreading credit around. But the benefits of it accrue to the stockholders of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who tend to be very wealthy, and they basically create a political machine in Washington, D.C. that uses campaign contributions and charitable donations and sort of foundation grants to basically create a political machine to make sure that the government doesn't try to reform Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, even after scandalous information had been revealed about dubious accounting practices at the two giant federal credit institutions. And, of course, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac lend with reckless irresponsibility. And when the housing crisis comes in 2008, the two of them go belly up. And they had also contributed to it with their recklessness. And so this is a really, to my mind, this is a really great, relatively recent example of how our noble nationalistic intentions can end up, you know, benefiting the wealthy, distorting our Republican, small r, Republican political process, and ultimately, in some worst-case scenarios, working against our own ambitions to, home ownership was really negatively affected by the housing crisis, which itself was caused by public policies meant to encourage home ownership.
Well, and again, I think I can hear James Madison's voice saying, you know, ambition, corruption, greed, factions, all those kinds of things he talks about as well. And, of course, you even have a chapter on intrigue and corruption, which now, of course, takes us later to the second Bank of America, but nevertheless, some of those illustrations there as well. We need to take a break, and when we come back, though, I thought for just a minute I might chat with you about your other commentary, which is the Declaration of Independence was more radical than any of the men who signed it. If for no other reason than we just, of course, went through a celebration, of course, of this nation's history and of the Declaration, and I thought that would be another aspect of that as well. But as we have been talking about, just some great material that helps us understand some of the clash of values which we run into even to this day, that go all the way back between the clash between individuals at one point were friends, later probably almost enemies, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, individuals that serve the country in different contexts and different situations. And when we come back, we'll continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Jay Cost. If you'd like to know more about him, we have information about him on our website, including his website, jcost.com. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Jay Cost with us for just a few more minutes. I might again mention his book, The Price of Greatness, which you can find in your local bookstore. And that has caused us to certainly spend most of our time talking about the Constitution. But Jay, I thought for just a minute, we might go back to the Declaration of Independence. Of course, on the 4th of July, we always love this phrase about the fact that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. But you also, in this piece that came out just recently, said that one thing we overlook is this idea of popular sovereignty. Who should rule the body politic? And in some respects, we've taken that for granted. And yet, if you think about this, when we look at all the opportunities that we have given to individuals over time, in some respects, the unfulfilled promise at the Declaration, but the fulfilling of those promises over time in terms of suffrage and voting rights and all sorts of other rights. A lot of that goes back to this idea of we the people, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. I was inspired to write the piece because I feel like the founders, the authors of the Declaration of Independence are criticized, and in many respects rightly so, for, many of them were slaveholders, and of course this was before women had the right to vote, and voting such as it was usually limited to property ownership. So there was a very narrow cast of people who were considered, citizens in the full sense of the word in 1776. And the Declaration itself does not directly challenge that, but the Declaration unleashes an idea that has really worldwide radical implications, which is that government ultimately is founded upon the free and equal consent of the governed, and that protections or sort of privileges for certain groups of people over other groups of people that are bottomed on the government are illegitimate, that there is to be no ruling, governing elite who occupy the position because of who their parents happen to be. George III is not entitled to any sorts of governing authority that the average American citizen is. This is an idea that is embedded in the Declaration of Independence, and I think it is why so many of the civic revolutions in our country, the abolition of slavery, the suffragette movement, the promotion and expansion of civil and voting rights in the 1960s, all of these movements end up using and sort of appropriating logic and rhetoric and ideas that themselves come from the Declaration of Independence, because that document really unleashed a force into the world that was more transformational than the people who came up with the idea in the first place.
And again, some of that was, to use a phrase that Martin Luther King used, the uncashed checks or the unfulfilled promises. But it did unleash this idea that it is, of course, you've quoted a couple of times Abraham Lincoln, of the people, by the people, for the people. But it was the idea that only the people have control over the government. And over time, some of those flaws that were inherent in both the Declaration and the Constitution, because of slavery, because of a number of other issues, eventually began to be resolved. And so in some respects, when people ignore what was a very radical document, that is the Declaration of Independence, as you point out, it was in some respects more radical than any of the men who signed it.
Yeah, and it really puts in the mind of the people, right? The Declaration has a transformational effect on the public consciousness. I mean, I think a great illustration of this is the 19th Amendment, right, which guarantees women the right to vote. And it was passed by a body politic that at that time was completely made up of men. So what men collectively decided to do in the 19 teens was dilute their voting strength by 1/2, by basically doubling the size of the electorate. And they agreed to do this because the suffragette movement grounded its claims for the right to vote in these ideas that had just become the way Americans thought about politics, by grounding it in the notion of equality and liberty and the fact that we all should be free and equal citizens. Men volunteered to expand the size of the electorate. It's really an extraordinary thing that happened in the United States of America. And I mean, really, you don't see revolutions like that in world history without any shots having been fired. It's really extraordinary. And I think the credit for that has to go, at least in part, to these ideas that were unleashed by the Declaration, and they take on a force of their own that is above and beyond anything that the original authors probably could ever have envisioned.
Again, just some great material. Let me just again point people to your website, jcost.com. Your most recent one is Wither Civic Virtue. We certainly do need some civility and civic virtue, don't we? And, of course, James Madison spoke to that issue, as, of course, did all of the founders of the Framers in one way or another. So just a lot of great material. But as people go to your website, what's available? Because I would assume that some certainly would want to order the book. Are you ever available for speaking or other opportunities to educate people about American history?
I am, yes, and I'm on Twitter. You can find me on Twitter at jcosttws, and my email address is over at my Twitter site. So if people are interested in having me for speaking engagements, I don't have like a booking agent or anything like that, but I love coming out to speak to people about the Constitution. And to that point, I also have a podcast that I co-host called Constitutionally Speaking, where we basically break down the meaning and history and origins of the Constitution and try and explain in a simple everyday language without dumbing it down for people who really want to understand how our Constitution came into being but are not themselves specialists is sort of our agenda there, which you can find it. We're on the Ricochet Podcast Network, and also it's on iTunes or Stitcher or whatever your podcast audio source is. You can find Constitutionally Speaking there.
And I might mention that as people look at your picture on our website, pointofview.net, we have a link to the Twitter post. If they go to the section there on JCOS, we have a link to your email, Twitter, other contact information, and, of course, other books, articles, and resources. So, again, if nothing else, I thought this was such an excellent book, and I first heard about it by reading your piece in the National Review, and continue to enjoy reading you from a weekly basis. So look forward to the next opportunity, and thank you again for writing the book, The Price of Greatness, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Oh, thank you so much, Kerby. You've been so generous with your time. I really appreciate it.
That's all we have for today, but as you well know, as you listen to Point of View, we really like to educate you about American history, especially focusing on, when we can, on America's godly heritage, and we certainly are the beneficiaries of those who have come before us, and I think it is important from time to time to take a break and spend a little bit of time learning about our history so that we can apply it to our lives today. And as you can see, whether we look at Alexander Hamilton or James Madison, some of the conflict and some of the clash of values that surfaced in the 18th century surface even today. So it's important to understand where those came from. If you'd like to know a little bit more about this book or any other topic that we've addressed, certainly you can go to the website, pointofview.net. I have my Viewpoints commentary today. We have the Take Action. We have videos and other resources. So I hope that you will visit the website, pointofview.net. If you can help us out financially, of course, we are dependent upon your financial gifts to bring this program to you. And if you've said, boy, I've learned a little bit more about history today that I don't think I would have ever learned if I hadn't tuned in to Point of View, hope you might click on that button that says donate and certainly take the time to support this ministry. If you'd like to listen to it again, of course, you can download the podcast, or you can go to the YouTube channel and watch it and learn and maybe even pass it on to others. So that's all we have for today. Let me just mention that some great resources are available on our website. So if you'd like to know a little bit more about some of the things we've been talking about today, all available at the website, pointofview.net. And one more time, if you would maybe consider clicking on that button that says donate, we would greatly appreciate your financial support. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. See you back here next time.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.